Good morning. Let's get started with the French Revolution today. My goal today is to kind of cover the very earliest phase of the French Revolution, kind of the summer of 1789. What we did yesterday, remember, was to talk about the background of the revolution, frustration over taxes and unjust government systems, and the really important economic pressures of the failed harvests and the economic downturn of manufacturing slowdowns and unemployment. And then, of course, the king's decision to call for a meeting of the Estates General, and the idea would be that he was going to enforce a new tax. But when the Estates General met, which was actually the first time it had met in like 170 years, it got pretty chaotic pretty quickly. So here's what happened. So we have these three estates, which we talked about yesterday. Remember, the clergy are the first estate, the nobility is the second estate, and then the third estate is everybody else. 26.5 million people. And one of the things that they're frustrated with is the way that the Estates General is set up, which is each estate gets one vote. And that obviously is not equal when it comes to the numbers. That doesn't bear out equally. So what the third estate did when they arrived for the Estates General, when it was called in the summer of 1789, is they announced that they desired to set up a constitutional government. Up to this point, France was an absolutist monarchy with sort of a nod towards parliamentary procedure with the Estates General, but the kings really had all the power. And so the third estate said, no, what we want to do is we want to set up a constitutional government. Think of it like the way England functioned. France actually sort of envied the English system to a certain degree, which you know a little bit because remember Montesquieu actually favored the English system. The other thing that the third estate announced that they want to do is to say that the tax shortfall that they were suffering would be solved if the first and second estates paid taxes. They said if the third estate is the only one that pays the tax, it's not right. So what if we enforce this tile tax against the first and second estates? They also said, lastly, we're going to change the way voting is done. We don't want it to be based on each estate having one vote, but rather each member of the Estates General to get a vote. So there were about 300 clergy members of the Estates General, the first estate, about 300 members of the second estate, the nobility, and then about 600 members, a little bit more than that, for the third estate. So they've proposed if everybody had one vote rather than each estate getting one vote, it would be fair and the people would have a bit more of a voice. And so when they made these declarations on June 17th that they were going to draft a constitution and that they were going to make all these changes, they actually found themselves locked out of the Estates General. The first and second estates basically locked the third estate out of the conversation, wouldn't let them in. So the third estate marched to a nearby tennis court, which you have to understand in those days tennis courts were actually indoors, and it was very much an aristocratic sport. Upper class people playing tennis, you know, and having tea and all that. But they went to a tennis court, which amounts to a sort of a gymnasium inside of the complex, and they swore an oath. It's very famously called the tennis court oath. And they said, listen, we're going to keep meeting, even though they locked us out, we're going to keep meeting until we have a constitution drafted. And this sort of set them up with in tension with the king who had ordered them to cease and desist. And they said, no, we're not going to. And so this leads to maybe the most famous moment of the entire storyline, the French Revolution, is the Bastille. King Louis XVI realized that there was a little bit of trouble on his hands with the way that the third estate was progressing and the way that they were preparing a constitution. And so he was getting ready to use force against them. And this was a rumor, but also sort of backed up by evidence. And this rumor was spreading very, very quickly. And the third estates being the estate of the people, started to mobilize against the king in some ways. What happened on July 14th, 1789, is that a crowd of Parisians gathered around the Bastille. Now, a couple of things about this. The Bastille is like, well, it's a fortress, or I should say it was a fortress. It's a prison. It's where you might keep a garrison of troops. And it really represented the king's power in Paris. The king often stayed out at Versailles, although he did have a palace in the city called the Louvre. And then he had this fortress, the Bastille, and political prisoners and people who had spoken out against the government might be kept prisoner there, actually. The second thing to say is that this crowd had actually started to gather because the price of bread had gone up again and they were starving. So what ends up happening is this crowd gets very, very agitated, especially at the rumors that the king's troops are mobilizing. So they force down the drawbridge of this Bastille. And it turns into 4 hours of fighting between the troops and the people. And there's guns being fired, and there's hand-to-hand combat, and eventually the crowd overcomes the Bastille. They release the prisoners that are held in there. They even cut off the head of the warden of the Bastille. And then they get angry because there wasn't the ammunition and weapons inside that they had believed would be in there. And so they just tear down the Bastille brick by brick. The Bastille is a very famous thing, and so if you go to Paris today, some people want to visit it, but you can't. All you can visit really is an outline on the ground. There's kind of a courtyard, and you can see where the Bastille was. But you cannot see the Bastille because they tore it down on July 14th. This is actually considered sort of their Independence Day in France. We celebrate July 4th, obviously for our independence, and they celebrate July 14th. Bastille Day is a very similar kind of celebration. So what ends up happening is sympathy revolts pop up all over France. Villages and towns all over France start to revolt. And then that gets a little bit more intense when rumors start to spread that there are armies coming from foreign nations. You can imagine kings and queens around Europe are not going to be happy about revolution. They don't want it to spread to their countries. And the other thing about it is that the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette at this time, was Austrian. So people assumed that the king would be able to call on his allies and help to put down the revolution, and that was the rumor. So what French peasants began doing is breaking into the homes of the aristocrats to destroy any evidence of the financial obligations that they had towards these lords and towards these aristocrats. You can see very clearly an economic motivation then for this revolution. There were taxes they hadn't been able to pay, there were debts they hadn't been able to pay, and they were trying to destroy the evidence of that. So what ends up happening after that is the Third Estate has been continuing to meet, and they declared it a national assembly. Rather than the Estates General with the nobility and with the clergy, it's just the Third Estate, really, and they're meeting to outline their ideas and draft a constitution, and they call this the National Assembly. And they're voting on what kinds of changes they want to make. This is, in a sense, the fulfillment of their tennis court oath. And so they are voting to abolish all legal privileges of the nobles and of the clergy. And their work is going to culminate on August 26th with what's called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It's a very, very famous document. This document is influenced by the British Bill of Rights. It's hard for Americans to fathom, but the British Bill of Rights was extensive and very, very liberal for its day. And actually, the American Bill of Rights is, in a sense, patterned after it. But also the American Declaration of Independence has influence on this Declaration of the Rights of Man by the French. It's got Enlightenment principles, and it's based on this idea that all men are created equal and they're equal before the law. And it's trying to abolish this tiered aristocratic system in France. And they want to say everybody who has access to public office and military appointments and things like that it should be based on talent and not on birth. Now, one of the side notes, I shouldn't say side note, one of the sticking points with the Declaration of Rights of Man is that women were not directly included in the language, and that frustrated a lot of people. Some women started to write and speak out against that particular misstep. Um, and women will play an important role going forward, as we will see here with the king. The king had been basically staying out at Versailles and trying to avoid the trouble and the chaos of Paris. The crowds of Paris were pretty riled up, and so he was staying in Versailles, and the people were still starving. And so in October of 1789, women, a very large crowd of women, marched out to Versailles. They were having a hard time feeding their children and feeding their families, and so they marched out to Versailles, and they were carrying pitchforks and swords and pistols and muskets. Today, it's about a 45-minute train ride from downtown Paris, so to speak, to Versailles. So you can imagine it's quite a long walk. It took them most of the day to get there, and they sort of forced the king to give them an audience to hear them out. And they actually, in a sense, forced the king back to Paris. They sort of dragged the king and his family from Versailles and take them back to Paris. And the king is trying to smooth things over, so they brought with them wagon loads of flour to try to feed the people and try to feed the crowds. But at this point, the king is essentially a prisoner in Paris. He's staying in the Louvre, and he's got freedom of movement there, but he's kind of a prisoner, and it's actually going to get worse for him as the crowds get even more agitated as time goes on. But these women are playing a very important role in the revolution and pushing the revolution to become even more liberally minded towards equality for all people. So we'll pick up on that story tomorrow. I'm going to start putting together a worksheet for you so that you can be tracking with the information, and just be looking for that later today. And I'll try to publish that this afternoon so you can be working on it. Hope you guys are doing well, and let me know if you have any questions.